We're delighted you're joining us to talk about navigating regulatory exams under this best interest era, regime, time period, whatever you want to call it. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording the session. We plan to share it with you following the conversation today. As always, we welcome your engagement throughout the session today. Please feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of your screen using Zoom to submit any questions to our panelists. It can happen throughout the conversation, and as always, we welcome it. And we plan to take them up at the end of the session, sort of the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation. All right, to get us started, I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. Mr. Wagner, can I start with you? You are on mute. It happened the first person.
That always happens that way. Sorry about that, and thanks, Param. Nice to meet you all. I'm Ed Wegner, and I am the practice lead for governance, risk, and compliance for Oyster Consulting. I've been with Oyster since the middle of 2020. Prior to that, I worked for FINRA for 22 years, where I had the pleasure of working with Mitch Atkins. I was the Midwest Regional Director responsible for the exam and surveillance program for firms that were located in the Midwest.
Thank you, Ed. Mitch Atkins, do you mind going next?
That's me. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Param, for having me. Like Ed, I was a senior VP and regional director for the South region for FINRA, where I worked for 20 years. And I've been doing consulting for almost 11 years now, and enjoy being on the helping side a lot. And I'm looking forward to our presentation today.
Fantastic. Ed and Mitch, thank you for joining us. George, do you mind going next?
Thanks, Barb. Thanks, everybody, for joining. My name is George Sarlanis. I'm the head of supervision at Snowden Lane. I've been in the supervision role for 17 years. Thoroughly enjoy it. I don't have Mitch and Ed's background at FINRA, just following the rules. Started off years ago as a regional director in supervision for the East Coast, and then moved over to Snowden Lane as their head of supervision here.
Fantastic. Thank you for making time to join us, George. Mr. Randy Barnes.
Hey, thanks, Param. And for those of you that had take yourself off mute on your bingo card, you can check that one off already. Thanks, Ed.
Glad I can help.
Yeah, guys, I'm a director of product and product development here at InvestorCom. 25-ish years in the financial services fintech space. Like George, I don't have the FINRA backdrop of my esteemed colleagues here, but certainly really love helping our clients in this market, find the right solution to these problems that keep cropping up in this bumper crop of opportunity that the regulators give us. So looking forward to today's conversation.
The bumper crop of opportunity. That's a new one. All right. You can always count on Mr. Barnes for coming up with these sayings. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Parm Messeri, President of InvestorCom. I'll be playing the moderator role here for the purpose of today's conversation. And if you haven't come across InvestorCom in the past, we are a software provider particularly in the best interest side of the regulatory compliance world. And our solutions are known across North America for their intuitive design. So we'll talk a little bit more about that down the road. Having said that, let's jump into the agenda and what we plan to discuss today. We're going to start with, given the topic of navigating regulatory exams, we're going to talk a little bit about recent exams and enforcement activity that we've observed in the marketplace. We'll share with you some industry observations, some trends we've seen in the past across the wealth of experience that's on the panel here today, and then what could be a strategic response amidst the current regulatory climate and change that we're seeing. So we're going to end off with that. And as always, please engage. If you've got some curveball questions, as hard as they are, this is the panel to ask. And there goes my camera for no reason. I'll be right. Here we go. Okay. Without further ado, let's jump into things. What we know is there has been some enforcement activity percolating on the horizon. There's been recent cases going back to, I want to say, the sort of the 6-month mark, and the level of fines on the best interest side of the fence has been picking up. We've summarized some of those on the left-hand side, and then also, as you're seeing on the screen, just shared some of the feedback that we've garnered across our clients, as well as our discussions with regulators. As this effectively serves as the backdrop to today's conversation, but let's ask the experts. Mr. Wagner, what enforcement trends, if any, have you observed recently across FINRA and the SEC as it relates to Reg BI? And are there any lessons, are there any insights that you mind sharing with our audience today?
Yeah, thanks, Param. And I think it's a great question. I think as we've been talking about this over the years, we've really been kind of looking forward and, what can we expect from regulators? And I think now that we're, several years into this, we can kind of look and say, what have we been seeing and how do we adjust? And like the exam program that the regulators had in terms of Reg BI efforts, I think the enforcement cases have been evolving in a similar fashion. I think they started out by focusing on low-hanging fruit, things like disclosures, Form CRS, just making sure firms had a Reg BI compliance program, and then have been moving to more substantive issues and findings. So maybe to start out, one thing I would just encourage firms to do, around those low-hanging fruit items is just make sure that you have those things nailed down, like your Reg BI disclosures, your Form CRS, both in terms of the content of those disclosures, but also the timing of delivery, because those are really easy cases to find and bring. So you want to make sure that you have those buttoned up. But with regards to the more substantive areas, while the cases have been picking up, I don't significantly see a difference in the types of cases that are being brought relative to what they used to bring with respect to the suitability rules. The areas of focus that the regulators have been considering really haven't changed, but what's changed is Reg BI really sets a higher standard, right? And it also provides the regulators with better tools for addressing these concerns that they've had over a long period of time. So based on the recent enforcement cases, some of the areas that I would focus attention on are recommendations around complex products. We've seen them bring cases around things like L bonds, structured notes, alternative investments, things that are complex or risky. Cases related to higher costs, whether that's higher cost products or activity, share class recommendations, anything related to where they see that customers are being charged higher costs, they're going to focus on, and we've seen some enforcement cases related to that. Some of the areas that they've traditionally looked at in the past, but are focusing it under the Reg BI lens, are things like 529 plan recommendations. And another area that's received a considerable amount of attention, and this is something that I anticipated, is excessive trading. It's been an area, Mitch, I'm sure you remember, that was a real area of focus for FINRA, and an area that could be kind of difficult bringing cases because of some of the elements that you had to demonstrate when trying to bring those cases. That could be really tricky. The main one being needing to demonstrate de facto control when bringing those cases. With Reg BI, one of the things that it did is to eliminate the requirement to demonstrate de facto control. So that's an example where Reg BI provided regulators a real significant tool to bring cases that they've been wanting to bring. And so you're seeing them be very aggressive in that space. So these have always been concerns for regulators. Now they're just, I think, better able to bring these cases, and you're seeing them be more aggressive in these areas. But some of the things that we haven't seen enforcement cases yet, but I would anticipate them to start focusing on, include areas like account type recommendations. You've seen them talk about this a lot. You've seen staff bulletins from the SEC. So both account recommendations in terms of the initial recommendation, switching from accounts going from a commission-based to fee-based or fee-based to commission-based, and importantly, rollover recommendations, which is an area, notwithstanding some of the uncertainty around the DOL's rules. The SEC has been very clear that they're focusing on rollovers and have very similar expectations in terms of the assessments that are done under Reg BI and the 40 Act. So those are areas that I would expect to see enforcement attention. I talked about costs, but one of the areas where I see them focusing on with respect to costs is just the reasonably available alternative assessment that firms are doing, looking at what's being recommended, what are the costs of comparable products, how firms are assessing that when making recommendations. So where they see that higher cost products are being recommended, expect them to really look at the process around reasonably available alternatives. Some other areas that have been focus areas for the regulators that I think they're going to focus on using Reg BI are conflicts of interest and the product review process. They talk about the care obligation being both customer specific recommendations, but also having a reasonable basis of understanding what products you're selling. I think they're going to look to make sure that firms have robust product review processes and looking at the product shelf. So I really think it's good for firms to take a look at all of those areas, make sure you have good procedures, good training, and importantly, really good monitoring around these areas.
Amazing. And you're so insightful in sort of knowing the space and obviously providing your views on what firms can do. Mitch, I know you and I have also chatted about this topic of core strategies for folks who are in compliance. What can firms do to mitigate these risks of potential enforcement activity or examination deficiency letters being written up by the lovely regulators?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's the million-dollar question right now. I think what Ed said about anticipating what's going to happen is really important. I mean, what we have seen so far, we talked about kind of the basics. Do you have procedures? And although in this month's disciplinary action, there was a case where the firm didn't have Reg BI procedures, but so they're still bringing those cases. But I suspect what FINRA is doing now is working a number of cases, and this is my speculation, but it's an educated speculation based on what I would be doing if I was there. They're working on a number of cases that involve the nuances of the care obligation, right? What Ed said about reasonably available alternatives, et cetera. So I think what firms need to do right now, and I'd say without delay, is to evaluate the tools that they're using. For example, if you use a form that you use to document best interest rationales, account type recommendations, reasonably available alternatives, look at that form and say, does it really get to the heart of the issue? And if you're relying on registered reps to draft these complex compliance type narratives about why they recommended what they recommended, make sure you're looking at those from a supervisory perspective and say, is it working, right? Can we go back 3 years down the road and say, I can justify to a regulator or an arbitration attorney that I did everything that the rule prescribed that I do, and we can back up our account type recommendation or our securities recommendation. These nuanced cases that I suspect that they will be bringing will involve much more complexity. And by design, those cases take a long time for a regulator to develop and to bring. So I don't think it's too late if you're looking at your processes, your tools to say, we reviewed all of these comments that were written by our registered reps, and they're just not cutting it, or checking the box is not enough. If we just gave them a check the box approach, we need to do more, and finding out from that review what you can do to enhance the documentation to the point where you're comfortable with what you have, that you can defend it. And I think it's been clear from both the SEC and from FINRA that we're not using the same template for our exams that we used when we started. we are, when we started, we wanted to see that you had the structure in place, that you didn't ignore the rule, and so on. And as they're evolving now, they've said, we're looking deeper, we're looking at more nuanced pieces of it. And they've kind of told you that's where they're going. So I think making that assessment now and determining whether you've got it or whether you don't is really important. And there are a lot of pitfalls in terms of, a lot of small and mid-sized firms are using manual processes, and it's totally acceptable to do that. But if you're going to do it, make sure that those pitfalls are not going to come back and bite you down the road. So that, I mean, in a nutshell, I think that's where we are and where we're headed.
Love it. Love it. Thank you, Mitch. So let me kind of turn to another dimension. And George, I wonder if I could pick on you because you've actually had the practical experience of having to go through some of these exams, and I know your firm has grown tremendously. Can you mind sharing just, obviously, in as much of a candid way as you possibly can, some of your experiences going through some of those exams? What strategies has Snowden Lane undertaken to mitigate some of these risks from a Reg BI perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Parham. Great question. It is true. I have been through quite a number of exams myself, also came from an examination background as well. So following up Ed and Mitch's experience with FINRA, it just kind of hits a tune in the back of my head of all the reminders of where I started and where I've gone. I think one of the benefits here at Snowden is it's been brought up before, but we really do a good job of being proactive and not reactive. I think as the industry continues to evolve, one of the major pluses you can do is to evolve yourself because regulators are continuing the way they evolve their exams as well. So they have found ways to automate and find technology ways to dig deeper. And we need to make sure that we have everything buttoned up to clear those as well. Recently, just the investments that we have, even with InvestorCom and other approaches, moving away from PDFs and paper and moving more towards an electronic aspect has been able to centralize our compliance and supervision. It makes those requests a lot easier. Some of these exams, our last one was over 2 years before we finally got to enforcement and what they wanted to do. And a lot of it is information gathering, right? So the faster we can respond and provide the diligence that we do from the supervision compliance side, we can continue to grow our business, which we have, and move forward in a compliant fashion. And as you said, Parm, we are growing and we're growing rapidly. So I always joked internally that, we look at written supervisory procedures as a standing instruction, but ultimately that document has to be one of the most flexible documents we have at the firm because there are so many rules and regulations in the way we view things that we have to be able to adapt our policies. And it all starts with making sure we document. And I think Ed hit it right on the head before. We had thought it was going to be a slower, start off with, is Form CRS good? Are you checking the minor boxes about why you do things? And it says it on the screen, right? It's here. So recently, anybody may have heard about, a recent broker dealer for the churning aspect of it, right? And I think Ed said as well that it's very easy now to pinpoint the Reg BI side behind it, and things like account type, you have to have that thorough analysis. You have to have the documentation and what you write. Is it enough? And I think Mitch hit that too. Can we rely on the notes and go back and defend why we did what we did years later? And moving towards that automation field of going through the questions that we have built to deliver an electronic method of this account type is recommended over this type. Here's why, here's the problem we're solving and why we chose the direction we did. And I think I'd be speaking to the choir when I say everything is always about documentation, documentation, documentation. So when we can actually pull these things and show clear evidence, here's the list of what we had automated, why we built what we did, and how we actually go about enforcing it is what goes a long way when we go through these regulatory exams. And I've been through one in the middle. I started one in the beginning, and having access and the availability and the flexibility to provide that has been crucial in how we have grown our business here at Snowden.
It's some of the things you said, George, just reminded me of the conversation we had around some of the feedback you'd received around the level of growth your firm has had and how compliance, I want to call it maybe compliance professionals or the rate of hiring of compliance professionals had not kept up with the rate of growth. Do you mind just sharing that anecdote and maybe just your response to that conversation?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Parham. So, working in several different broker dealers, you get to kind of cross-reference things that work. You get to bring new ideas into a new place and bring some old strategies. Being in this industry, I started off at the very tail end of where paper was big. I remember the first check-in app and how quick and easy it was. And so the idea and the reason why I fit so well into that role was I've been able to evolve and change management is huge. And one of the regulators that had come in and had said, the growth of the firm and how do you guys handle that from a supervisory perspective and staffing and all these things that they bring up. And to be able to show them the documentation of how we have been able to automate these processes that they were under the impression were going to be manually reviewed and addressed and supervised by teams of individuals was, I guess, quite a shock. The ability to structure the technology to address those questions just shows how far we've come in this industry where we can actually use automation and technology to actually, I don't want to say replace staff, but actually make the process even better by having that technology available to us. And I do believe from our conversation that we have is why Snowden is exactly where we are by utilizing those technology avenues. There's always business decisions to make. And there's always a cost to everything. And you have to outline, and I'm part of those conversations are, is there a good business case for the technology or is there a business case for staffing? And then you have to think about the level of service, right? So we can pull all of this information on a technology side where we can have multiple people reviewing certain things versus going down a road where we're still manually reviewing things or having, Excel files or, submitting a Word document with meeting notes and things of that nature. So those types of conversations come up and we've developed and included documentation in the way we do things, how we're going to grow our business. And we've actually been able to have those executive conversations where we analyze how much is on everyone's plate as far as workload and where can we take away from that and find ways to solve this using technology. And it's pretty amazing where sometimes the upfront cost can be eye-opening, but when you look at the big picture of what you can solve down the road as far as just adding certain aspects to what you've already built, you can continue to grow and you can continue to see that those expenses actually pay off down the road.
That's a great point, George, that the regulators have been clear. FINRA has been saying this in their priorities reports in a number of different areas, but it should never be set it and forget it. And you always have to constantly be reevaluating. And when you think of firms that are going through growth, that's one of the things that can have a major impact on your programs. And you need to make sure that you're adjusting your programs to fit that growth. One thing about technology is it allows you to adapt to that growth quicker, where if you're relying heavily on manual processes and people to do it, which are important components, but as you grow, you have to hire, train, and get all these people on board. And to the extent that you automate and become more effective in terms of adapting to these things through automation, I think that makes that process not only quicker, but also more cost effective in the long run. So when you're thinking about costs, don't think just about the cost at this point in time, think about it over the period of time and how that can help you become more cost effective over time as you grow.
It's a really good point, Ed. It looks like my camera just is having an episode again. Let me just turn it on and off again. But while I'm off, maybe I can ask my wonderful colleague Randy a quick question because, just piggybacking off of your points, both Mitch and Ed, you made the point around kind of moving forward, the particular areas of focus or examination or scrutiny are going to be around this assessment of available alternatives or reasonably available alternatives. Randy, I know you work with all of our clients. You've seen different industry observations across different approaches, different sort of segments of the industry, high net worth, whatever it may be. Can you talk a little bit about sort of some of the best practices and how that's typically led to better adoption across our client base?
Yeah, and by the way, your camera being off is not a fault, it's a feature of Zoom, just for those that are playing at home. Yeah, so look, one of the big things that we've been hearing a lot is that this conversation is largely bifurcated. In one side, you've got the almost kind of the top of the funnel, that the suitability type of profile saying, why is this type of instrument in my client's best interest? Because firms have gone down the path of, doing a lot of leveling of fees and all this other stuff to make inside the security class more equitable. But so why is a VA better than a mutual fund, better than a whatever, right? That's one camp. But then there's still the other camp of, and oh, by the way, within an asset class, why are you recommending this one versus that one? And yeah, cost is a big portion of that, but it's not just about the cost. There's risk profile, there's performance measurements, there's other features that come into play, and making sure that what we're seeing more of is trying to blend those two together somehow, some way, and kind of springboarding that into the whole conversation of how do you do that, right? If you're looking to do that with some paper forms, we've run into some people that have 6, 7, 8 different flavors of forms, all to perform an RAA assessment. I'll call it that, right? And so that becomes really onerous, really cumbersome to implement, to adopt in the field, to supervise on the backside. Like, it just becomes a bit of a quagmire. So we're hearing and seeing quite a bit of that. The other piece that I'll quickly touch on, I heard it from somebody at the recent CNL seminar here in Charlotte, and I also talked to a friend of mine who happens to be an advisor. Both of them said this concept of training, like making sure that you are constantly in the field's ear, on their desktop, understanding what does RAA mean, why is it important, why do they have to do it, is like paramount. I mean, George hit it on the head. There's so much change going on. This change management needs to be out in front of the field, and they need to understand that this isn't just another drop on the head, that there's a reason that we're doing this. It's valuable. This is why we're doing it. This is why we're doing it this way. So that you can, kind of help turn down some of that white noise that might come from this kind of lack of adoption framework.
Thank you, Randy. I'm going to start taking offense to your comments related to the camera, but I'll save it for later. So, folks, we've talked a little bit about kind of what we were seeing on the exam/enforcement front. There's been some information shared around best practices and the wide array of practices we've seen in the marketplace. I want to kind of turn everyone's focus now towards the phases of compliance that at least we've observed at InvestorCom, specifically around the initially when BI hit the marketplace, if I could call it that. There was this phase of goodwill compliance, and fast forward, a few, I'll call it months, people started from a change management perspective, really seeing that the regulators are serious, they're asking examination questions, and they've got to do something. And so what we saw across the marketplace was this sort of general adoption around, hey, can you attest that your recommendation, your investment vehicle that you're suggesting or account type is in your end investor's best interest? And sort of that, we call that the self-attestation phase. And I think what happened through the rounds of exams is that was basically called out. Of course, you're going to say something is in the investor's best interest, but really the purpose behind that analysis, the reasonably available alternatives analysis, is to articulate the why. And so what we've seen now, or more recently, is folks at firms have now become really, really familiar with the core concepts and now require firms to or financial professionals to document the why via, I'll call it PDF forms or manual processes, which in and of itself has a bit of a challenge because how can you actually supervise, provide some level of oversight? And to George's point, how can you scale your operations, right? If you have to consistently review manual documents, if it's a VA or a complex transaction. So those sort of waves of, I'll call it compliance, has been paramount, at least from what we've seen. But I'm curious, Ed, if I can kind of come back to you, seeing these phases of compliance, where do you think, how important is having a robust documentation slash audit trail process amidst these regulatory exams?
Well, it's really important. And going back to what George was saying, it's all about documentation, documentation, documentation. I think regulators have been saying that for a long time. It's an area that firms have been struggling with. And it's interesting. So when the SEC first put out their adopting release, they said that there really wasn't a requirement to document the basis for every recommendation. So given regulators' focus on documentation, I think that was really surprising to see, but I think what they were trying to do is to allow firms to have flexibility around this. They did say that there were certain circumstances where they would expect to see documentation. They talked about things like complex, risky, high-cost products, but it sort of left firms wondering where that line was. And so there was just a little bit of, I think, an appreciation for the flexibility, but concern about, are we getting it right? Are we documenting where we need to? And then recently, the staff of the commission issued a number of staff bulletins in different areas. And in those staff bulletins, they came out straight and said that it may be difficult to assess the adequacy and the effectiveness of a firm's policies and procedures or demonstrate compliance without documentation of the basis for the recommendation. So if that doesn't mean that they expect it in all cases, it means that they are expecting documentation in a lot of cases. And so that wondering where that line is, you know that they expect it probably more often than not. And so it leaves firms in a bit of a tricky spot. My suggestion with respect to documentation is to err on the side of documenting the rationale as much as possible, including the assessment that you do for reasonably available alternatives for a number of reasons, both because it's sounding like the SEC is expecting it, given the language that they're using, and you don't want to have to guess at it. But also, I recall working on examination and enforcement cases with FINRA, and I found that firms were more successful being able to address issues and concerns by the regulators when they had documentation to support the decisions that they were making. You might get to the point where you're quibbling a little bit over that rationale, but at least you have something to support it, and it shows that you had a process in place to consider it and document it. So I would definitely err on the side of documenting to the extent that you're not going to document everything, which is allowable based on what the SEC said. I would caution firms to be very clear in their procedures about what you document, what you don't document, and why. Make sure that you're training advisors and supervisors on what your policies say, and make sure that you're monitoring to make sure that documentation is being done when necessary. And then I would definitely document when you're recommending risky, higher cost, complex products. And importantly, look at the recommendations. And if it's the type of recommendation that you would anticipate getting questions about, I would document there too. So for example, if you're documenting a higher cost product to a client, you might have a great reason for that. I would document it because somebody might ask you, why did you recommend this higher cost product and not the lower cost product? So I would really try to focus on documenting as much as you can and really being thoughtful in those situations where you don't document.
That's really, really good point. specifically around, I mean, the recent case, I think, was around, it was the enforcement activity I saw, or settlement, I should say, around the firm that was using structured products. They had the policies and procedures. There was just no documentation surrounding the structural products that were being recommended. So Ed, I think that completely correlates with what you're sharing there. Mitch, and I think we're seeing some questions being shared as well, which is great. Whether there is documentation or not, I just wonder from a digital compliance perspective, is there value added from the perspective of reducing that regulatory risk for these wealth advisory firms?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think back to the small firm compliance call that FINRA put on Reg BI. And one of the things that they drove home during that call is they said, if you take nothing else from this call, make sure that you have a consistent process for documenting reasonably available alternatives considered and the costs of those alternatives, and that you provide guidance on how to do that, right? Because everybody can be doing it a different way. And no matter what it says in your procedures, if you have 300 reps, they could interpret it. Every one of them could interpret it differently. So with a digital solution to that, right, you're kind of guiding them through the process so that it involves actions and consistency. And you can get a result that you can support, right? Because it's driving them to do that, which is in contrast to, and a lot of firms have opted to go with the manual approach, right? The problem that I have seen with the manual approach so far, and I get it, small firms, very small firms, sometimes the cost is just prohibitive to go to a digital solution. But as you get more economies of scale in terms of the numbers, actually it can get cheaper to go with the digital solution, both in terms of documentation, risk reduction, and overall ability to look at what's happening, in scale, right? So, but assuming that you're using a form that you give them, like, okay, what did you consider? And you have 3 boxes they can check. The regulators have kind of said that a check the box approach is not sufficient. So what a lot of firms have done is they say, okay, well, here's the 3 boxes and then other, and they say, write a little something about, what you did. Well, if you look at those in any number, you find that registered reps in general, that's not really their skill set. Writing compliance-oriented rationales about what they did and why they did it that align with what regulators want to see, and that's not really what they do. And the reality is that a digital solution can often put structure around that works like a tool that actually helps them give better options to their client, while at the same time documenting why they did what they did in a way that's much faster than they could do if they were doing a check the box, kind of write a little narrative and going through those steps. So I think it makes a big difference. I guess the other thing I would say is it's really important how you set it up, and that you've got a process to go in and look at the outputs and what's what your system is generating. But yeah, I think it can make a big difference.
Thank you, Mitch. I completely agree. Randy, I wonder if this has kind of come up in our recent conversations when, there was that exercise we went through where the firm was trying to automate. They were sort of in the transitionary step of trying to automate their reasonably available alternatives. I'll call it best interest forms. And it was exactly what Mitch said. There was sort of these open-ended boxes for a financial professional. I'm laughing because I would just about run through a wall if somebody forced me to do something like that, right? Every single time a product's being recommended, write out, hey, I'm recommending Vanguard's whatever. And then here are the other alternative securities I've considered, their respective data points. To manually be able to articulate that consistently across a firm is such a challenge. But my rant aside, Randy, you went through that same exercise with me. Any thoughts on that experience?
Yeah, a couple. One being what's missing in all that conversation is a lot of these manual processes will typically also ask for a copy of where you got your information from, right? So if you're trying to grab some analytics on the cost or whatever, okay, print out where you got that and attach. Like that's just now you're talking about another step, another hurdle. That's a big deal. The other piece that tends to be hard to capture in some of these things is the actual the perspective of the client. And it kind of goes to Mitch's comment around the whole check the box exercise. We've heard that a ton as well. How you try to capture the perspective of the client in this analysis, however you're doing it, goes such a long way to indicating that it's not just a check the box template, that there is some good dialogue, some good know your customer type of process going on, which is huge. The other piece that I'll share that it hasn't come up yet, but just to keep firms thinking about this, right? The harder these processes are for your field, the harder it is for them to enjoy coming into work, right? Or the harder it is for you to be able to recruit advisors to come to work with you. We know that this is a pain point. So trying to make sure that you've got processes, whatever they might be, that are easy to adopt and aren't going to be a colossal pain, is going to serve you well in the long run as well.
Hey, just follow up on that too. Is just one of the other pieces of guidance the regulators have given on this is we don't want you to have a registered rep pick a product and sell that product and justify why they sold that product. We want you to start at the top and say, tell me about the client. What are the needs of the client? Then the next level is, should I recommend a mutual fund or a variable annuity or a stock or whatever? And we document that. And that's after the account type recommendation, right? Then you go down to the individual securities. And if you have a registered rep, for example, that always recommends a particular type of mutual fund and a particular class of that fund, it's going to be a huge red flag because the regulators are going to say, wait a minute, why is it that everyone's suitable? This is in the best interest of all of your clients. Are you even doing the top level analysis? And I think that the next level for the regulators is to say, we're also going to analyze the risk of the fund, the fees, what does it cost, and the performance. And so are you paying more for a fund that doesn't perform as well as its peer group and it takes more risk? Then that's going to be a problem any way you look at it. And I think I can see those kind of things developing into national sweeps where firms get letters from regulators that say, everybody who recommended this across their accounts, give us your best interest rationales and reasonably available alternatives considered. And if you don't have consistency across the process that you use, I think it's going to be really hard to defend that. And we all know how the regulators handled that in the past with the 12B1 sweeps and the 529 sweeps, where they just said, calculate all the money that you owe back and add interest and write a check. Nobody wants that. So I think in the area of digital compliance and tools, you have to factor in, even if the regulators don't successfully bring a case against you, if they just open an investigation and they spend 2 years tying up your compliance staff with these questions, you're producing records. And at the end of the day, they kind of say, well, we're on the fence. You still spent 6 figures and countless hours defending that. So I think you kind of have to factor that in as well.
So well said. Thank you for adding that, Mitch. Look, typically we ask poll audience questions ahead of our webinars. We're going to try asking a poll question now of our audience around what's the most common challenge from a manual compliance perspective. So, Ankit, if you don't mind just triggering that poll. So what is the top challenge from a best interest perspective if you have to track things manually? Is it looking up Form 5500 costs, comparing costs across investment products, the annual review / oversight of that process? Is it looking up the product itself, account type rationales we've talked about, or just documentation? I don't know if you all are seeing what I'm seeing, but it's sort of like this wild swing in the results. Let's give it a few more seconds.
I'm not seeing the results, Parham, but you guys made it hard by not including all of the above, because I think that would clearly
Oh
be
yeah, good
a
point.
popular answer.
Really good point.
That's the easy button, Ed.
That's right.
Okay. Oh, it's still changing. We got 53% participation rate, which is great. Let me just end the poll in a second, and 55%, 57%. See if we can get to 60, and then I'll end the poll. Just because I said that, it's not happening. Let me just end the poll and show the results. Can you all see the results now?
Yeah.
Documenting the analysis.
Documentation.
Interesting, the account type rationales is still is not perceived, at least by our sample size here, as being a top issue, but that does come up quite often across our client base. Fascinating. Thank you all for participating in that. Let me just stop sharing. And few more questions on my side, and then we can jump into audience questions. And again, I know Ankit's been asking, prompting folks on the chat here to ask questions. If you have any, please jump right in. Now, George, I know you and I have also talked about sort of the different tactics that can be taken when it comes to that best interest analysis or rationale process. There's sort of the long way around the block way of doing things, which is keying in every single variable, and then there is this advisor-led process. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences and what you've seen in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think the poll just that came up before was I kind of expected it. I was a little shocked with the numbers, but I did find that to be interesting. But I wanted to definitely hit on a lot of this that you said and Mitch has brought up in the digital solutions, especially in this realm. I have been an advocate of the digital solutions, and I saw even the question in the poll. At first, the first firm I started was a open checkbox, just radio buttons. Then that wasn't good enough, and then there was that. What Mitch was talking about is, did you do this? And then please explain the services, reasons, features, etc., everything about what you did. So I can get 10 financial advisors, recommend the same product, and get 10 different answers with none of them being what we're actually looking for, which is what Mitch said, right? You're starting with the conversation, you're information gathering, you're seeing where the client is, rather than going into some of these meetings with an idea of what you want to sell, right? So that's part of the documentation analysis. And I think the digital solution behind it is where the focus has become with my financial advisors, that I spend a wealth and a majority of my time in supervision training. And I appreciate that fact the most, because we have found that digital solution and the offerings that have been presented to us where we have the documentation, we have the timestamps, we have the requirements all in a centralized fashion, where these digital solutions are not open to interpretation, but they're actually facts that we can keep for documentation purposes. So I can spend that time with my advisors on training. Here's what's new. For example, running monthly calls about new hot items that we get from all the FINRA enforcements, a new regulation, a new rule, and adopting those into the policies and the plans that we currently have in place. So I just wanted to kind of echo that, because I think when Mitch had mentioned about hitting a radio button and writing in, and if that was suitable and good enough, it just brought me back to a prior exam where, the notes you get and how do you supervise that, right? How can you supervise the same product for the same so-called client profile and justify that reasonable list of alternatives were reviewed with these clients? So it makes it very, very difficult. It's very, very time consuming. And myself personally, and being in the role as the head of supervision, is really all about efficiency. I'm an advocate of it, and I remind everybody that come in that are used to the pen and paper that I have to constantly go to these training sessions and remind them that the technology is there to make your life easier, right? This is I think something that Randy had hit on before too, which was we don't want anybody to get frustrated. We don't want people to give up on technology and all that. We need to embrace it, and the tools are there. And that's something that Randy and I have also talked about with the digital space as well, which you know, it's not a less is more approach, but we are advocating this technology for the ease and the convenience, and we want to keep it that way so that we can streamline our processes going forward. And the way that we can do that is the digital aspect can actually make it more efficient and seem to actually push the requirements lower from a perspective versus a manual process that can be very extraneous. And like Mitch said, not everybody is a compliance writer, right? These financial advisors are out there to do their business and service their clients and not be in that realm to check the box of what's to be expected. So I think a lot of those points that everybody has been bringing up is just great highlights of the whole digital space and how the advisor process can actually seem overwhelming if you're not used to the technology, but it will pay for its dividends going forward.
Amazing, George. Thank you for sharing that. Mitch, I'm sorry, Ed, one quick question on, as firms are thinking about this, process, this evolutionary process that we had on screen earlier, sort of self-attestation, radio buttons, manual process, PDF form, and then potentially technology. As a firm who provides advice in this space, what are there any best practices / pitfalls that firms can watch out for when adopting, I'll call it, technology practices?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what everybody's been saying. You know, at the end of the day, I think you really take a step back. I don't think that the regulators, compliance, and the advisors in the field are really, they tend to talk past each other. I think they're all trying to get to the same place, right? Where the regulators have set out this requirement that you think about, okay, well, what are the needs of my client? What products are best to fit those? You know, thinking about things like costs and benefits and features and those types of things. What other products are out there that I should be thinking about? And then making a recommendation to the client that best fits their needs. I mean, that's what advisors do every day, right? So when you come up with a requirement that kind of says to do that, I think the challenge is that the documenting it, and then with compliance, thinking about, okay, well, we need to enforce compliance there, putting in processes in place. If you put in processes in place, to Randy's point, that are just going to be one more thing that they have to do, it's going to be very challenging. You're not going to get the adoption of the advisors in the field, which is going to lead to less compliance, which is going to frustrate the compliance department, which is going to end up being issues with respect to when the regulators come out to look at it. Where I see that firms can really benefit is if they integrate these requirements in this documentation into the processes that are already in place for your advisors. Like I said, you know, it's thinking about what the client's needs are, identifying products, assessing those, both the product itself and against the its comparables, and then making the recommendations. So in putting together a process, whether it's manual or tech driven, it's important that I think as best you can, just integrate it into their process and try to make it as easy as possible. We talked about this free-form text versus radio buttons and questions and things, and that's a challenge, because I think they both kind of serve a purpose. You want to be able to have a way to capture and drive people to make sure that they're doing the assessments the way that you want them to. And so questions that lead them down a path is a great thing to have. But you can't answer all those things just with pre-formed questions. So you want to have the ability to provide some narrative around why this was in a client's best interest, especially if it's something that maybe it's more costly, but there's a benefit that you think is good for your client. So you want to be able to explain that, allowing them to be able to do it. But where I've seen firms struggle is they'll either have a very loose narrative-based approach, then they'll have issues, and then they react by putting in a very prescriptive, very difficult, multiple pages and things in place. And then that causes issues in the field. So while I would avoid just having free-form text, I think it's a good place. It's a good thing to have in there. but don't overcomplicate the process. Understand, well, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to drive to? What's the most efficient way to get that information without overcomplicating the process? Because I think if you get that adoption of the advisors in the field, if they see the benefits that they get from an automated solution, I think you're going to get better adoption than if you try to go with maybe a lower cost, at least what you think is a lower cost manual process.
Yeah, and just to quickly piggyback on that, Ed, 100% agree. And I think the best way for firms to think about how they do that is to actually be deliberate and pull together kind of a cross-functional set of stakeholders to determine and have these types of conversations. Because if it's just all in the purview of one group, you've got a myopic view of this has got to be compliance, and it's compliance, and it's compliance, or this has got to be rep friendly, and it's got to be this. Like, you need to be able to bring those guys, those groups together to be able to be deliberate about how you roll something like this out.
This was so helpful, so good. I see some questions. Let me quickly flip to them. There's a question around radio buttons and documented or premeditated narratives or limited narratives. I think we've tackled that one between what Mitch shared earlier and Ed, you talked about just now. Let me jump to there's a couple of questions relating to account type analysis, and they're slightly complicated. So let me just paraphrase to the best degree I possibly can. There's a question surrounding account type analysis, and if I'm an IAR, would I necessarily need to make an account type rationale if Reg BI doesn't necessarily apply to me?
Well, it's interesting. And one of the things that I've noticed, especially with the recent staff bulletins that have come out from the SEC, well, I think Reg BI was meant to understand the distinctions between what broker-dealers do and what investment advisors do and have slightly different standards. I think they're trying to leave as little light between those two requirements as possible. And so in the staff bulletin that they put out around account types, they talk both about the requirements for broker-dealers and investment advisors. They're not distinguishing between the two. So whether you're thinking about what you need to do as a broker-dealer under Reg BI or as an investment advisor rep under the fiduciary requirements under the 40 Act, the requirements, at least according to the SEC and their staff bulletin, aren't very different. So I think that, the question about the jurisdictional issue has always been an issue out there, especially for FINRA, because of their narrow jurisdiction. I think Reg BI and trying to make it as close to the requirements under the 40 Act as possible, one of the reasons was to eliminate those differences, and so that there wasn't the regulatory shopping or arbitrage that has happened in the past.
Thank you, Ed. That's certainly also consistent with what we've been hearing whenever we call up regulators and ask similar questions, in that the account type, the best interest concept in and of itself doesn't sort of change between a investment advisory representative or broker-dealer. Fundamentally, it's about what's in the investor's best interest, and making sure that, for example, an advisory account, if it's coming from a brokerage, is actually in the investor's best interest. Folks, I'm always shocked at how fast time flies. There's a lot of prep and work that goes into these, but man, oh man, they're insightful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Ed, Mitch, George, maybe not Randy for his comments. Thank you very much for joining us today. Always, always grateful for your insights.